She very nearly did not live long enough to lift a racket at all. The story that would end with more major championships than any player who has ever drawn breath began in a delivery room in Albury in the winter of 1942, with a mother who almost died and a baby girl so sickly the family half expected to lose her. That is where you have to start, because everything that came afterwards, the 7 Australian titles in a row, the calendar Grand Slam, the 24 singles majors nobody in the men's or women's game has yet surpassed, sits on top of that first fight, the one she won before she knew what winning was. Margaret Smith arrived on the 16th of July, small and struggling, the youngest of 4 in a family that owned neither the house they slept in nor a motorcar to leave it in. And she made it. She always did have a way of making it. The house itself tells you more than any trophy cabinet ever could. 2 bedrooms, thin asbestos walls, a tin roof that ticked in the summer heat and drummed in the autumn rain, stretched somehow to hold 6 people on the edge of a country town in the state's southeast, out where the Murray runs its slow brown line between New South Wales and Victoria. Her father, Lawrence, was a foreman at a cheese and butter works, a decent, hard-working man who came home smelling of the factory, and neither he nor Maud had the faintest interest in tennis. 2 of Margaret's siblings raced bicycles, and that was the extent of the family's sporting ambition. There was no plan for her. There was no coach waiting, no pushy parent with a vision. There was only a skinny, restless girl and, by the greatest stroke of luck a working-class kid could hope for, 24 grass tennis courts directly across the road. You have to picture what she was as a child, because it explains the woman.
She was a tomboy in the fullest, most fearless sense of that word. The ringleader of a pack of neighborhood boys who climbed trees, swung out over the river on ropes, and hitched free rides on the trucks that had to slow for the tight bends on the road nearby. She played cricket and softball and basketball and football with the lads, and she was the first one out the door of the parochial school at St. Bridget's the moment the bell rang, desperate to be moving, to be running, to be doing. Movement was her whole language before she had the words for it. And directly opposite this asbestos house full of movement sat all that beautiful, forbidden green. She discovered tennis on her own, and there is something perfect about that. No one handed it to her.
She found an old fence paling, a picket, a bit of scrap timber, and a worn tennis ball, and she began smacking it against the wall of the family garage, hour after hour, day after day. A left-handed kid teaching herself the rhythm of the game against a sheet of weatherboard. Think of the sound of it, because half of Australia grew up with that sound in one form or another. The flat thock of a ball against timber in the late afternoon. The light going gold and then grey. A kid who would not come in for tea. There was no net and no lines and no opponent. Only the wall, which never got tired and never let her win cheaply and never once told her to go home. Whatever discipline she carried into the biggest arenas in the world was forged first in that most solitary of exercises. A child and a wall, and the patience to do the same simple thing 10,000 times, until her body stopped needing to think about it. Then she and the other children started slipping through the fence onto those 24 courts whenever they stood empty, playing until an adult chased them off, coming back the next day to do it all again. This went on for a couple of years, and it might have gone nowhere at all, might have stayed a childhood memory of stolen games on borrowed grass, if not for a man named Wal Rutter. Rutter ran the place, the coach, the professional, by some accounts the owner, and by others little more than the caretaker, the truth of it softened now by time. What matters is that he watched this particular urchin hammering balls with more purpose than the others, and instead of throwing her out for good, he did the opposite. He gave her a membership. He gave her lessons. He gave a girl from a family that could not have afforded a single formal coaching session the thing she needed most, which was a door held open. She would say for the rest of her life that Wal Rutter made her a tennis player. He drilled her strokes, yes, but he gave her something less teachable too, the killer instinct, the refusal to ease off, married strangely to a strict sense of sportsmanship. He also did the one wise thing that changes a life. He saw that his own gift had a ceiling, and he refused to be the man who capped her. There was a natural left-hander in front of him, and it was Rutter's circle who persuaded her to switch to the right hand, a decision that seems almost reckless now, and yet produced one of the most formidable forehands the game had seen. Her schooling ran alongside all this in the ordinary way of a Catholic country upbringing. St. Bridget's first, then St. Augustine's Convent across the river in Wodonga on the Victorian side, and later Albury Technical College. But school was never where her heart lived. Her heart lived on the grass, and on the road that separated the grass from the house, a road she crossed so many times it might as well have been a bridge between two versions of herself. On one side, the crowded asbestos box and the smell of the butter factory on her father's clothes, and the plain, unremarkable poverty of the times. On the other, 24 courts where a shy, wiry girl could become, for an hour at a stretch, something more than the sum of her circumstances. It is easy now, from the far end of an extraordinary life, to make her childhood sound like destiny. It was not destiny. It was luck and stubbornness and a coach with a kind streak, and it could just as easily have amounted to nothing at all. By the time she was 13, word had travelled far enough that Frank Sedgman, one of the great Australian champions of the era, took a look at the girl from Albury and said out loud what nobody around her had dared to think, that she might be the first Australian woman to win Wimbledon. Imagine hearing that as a working-class 13-year-old whose family did not own a car. Imagine carrying it. At 16, she left home for Melbourne to train full-time under Sedgman, living with her older sister, and here the myth of the effortless prodigy dissolves entirely, because there was nothing effortless about any of it. To pay her way, she worked as a receptionist at Sedgman's squash courts and gymnasium. She earned the training that other players were simply given, and the training itself was brutal in a way no woman in Australian tennis had really been subjected to before. This is the part that gets lost when people reduce her to a list of titles. Under Sedgman, and under the fitness man Stan Nichols, Margaret was put through a conditioning regime built for a professional male athlete, and applied to a teenage girl who had never questioned whether her body could take it. She ran, she lifted, she trained her strength to a level that female tennis had simply not seen, so that when she walked onto a court, she was not merely more skilled than the woman across the net, she was demonstrably stronger, fitter, faster to it. Keith Rogers shaped her strokes, and Sedgman shaped her tactics, but Nichols shaped the engine, and the engine was the difference. All those childhood years of volleying against a garage wall and scrambling with boys twice her weight had left her with hands and instincts at the net that most players never develop. Now she had a body to carry them. She was, in the plainest terms, an athlete first and a tennis player second, and in an age of polite baseline exchanges that made her almost frightening. Consider the era she was walking into. Women's tennis in the late 50s and early 60s was still played largely as a genteel pastime, a game of grace and touch and long, patient rallies, with a lingering assumption that a lady on court ought to look composed above all else. Into that world came a tall, rangy girl from the bush who covered the court like a middle-distance runner, who attacked the net with a physical certainty the sport had not really seen from a woman, who simply overpowered opponents who had never before met an opponent that could overpower them. Her serve had genuine venom. Her reach at the net turned other players' best passing shots into routine volleys. She was 5'9", all levers and strength, and she used every inch of it. There was nothing dainty about the way Margaret Smith played tennis, and that, more than any single stroke, was the revolution she brought. The arrival of the athlete in a game that had thought of itself as something else. She was 17 when she won the Australian singles title for the first time in 1960. 17. A girl who had been sneaking through a fence a few short years earlier now stood as her nation's champion, and she did not let go of that title for a very long time. She won it again in 1961, and 1962, and 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 7 consecutive Australian championships, a stranglehold on her home tournament that reads like a misprint. In 1962, she added the French and the American titles too, and there was talk,
real talk, that this country girl might do something almost no one had done. She was ranked the best in the world. And then Wimbledon. Everyone who knew her knew what Wimbledon meant, because Sedgman had planted that particular seed when she was 13. She had reached the top of the game everywhere else, but the grass of the All England club had a way of exposing her, unsettling her, and there was a nervousness in her that the crowds and the history and the sheer weight of expectation could bring boiling to the surface. For a player so physically dominant, Margaret carried a curious fragility of nerve, a susceptibility to the jitters that her opponents learned to look for. She was a powerful athlete prone to sudden self-doubt, and nowhere did that contradiction show itself more cruelly than on the most famous lawns in the sport. This is the paradox at the center of her, and it is what makes her a person rather than a machine. Here was the strongest woman in the game, the one who could out-hit and outrun anybody alive, and yet she could be undone from the inside, by the whispering of a big crowd, by the sense of a title within reach, by the terrible arithmetic of expectation that turns a routine forehand into an impossible risk. She would arrive at Wimbledon carrying not just her own hopes, but a nation's, a whole country waiting for its first female champion, Sedgman's old prophecy hanging over every point. And her body, so reliable everywhere else, would occasionally betray her at exactly the wrong moment. The arm tightening, the feet a half step slow, the certainty draining out of her like water through cupped hands. She learned, over years, to master it. But it never fully left her, and there is something oddly reassuring in that. Something that closes the distance between the untouchable champion and the rest of us. Even she was afraid of something. Then, in 1963, at 21, she finally broke it. She won Wimbledon, and in doing so completed the career Grand Slam, all 4 majors, younger than almost anyone before her. The first Australian woman to win at the All England club, exactly as a stranger had predicted 8 years earlier to a child who owned 1 second-hand racket. But titles are the easy part of a life to write down. The harder, truer part is the woman living inside all that winning. And by the middle of the decade, Margaret Smith was quietly coming apart at the seams. Understand the world she was moving through. This was semi-amateur tennis, before the money came, before the Open era cracked the sport open in 1968. She was traveling the globe as the finest female player alive, and she was, by the standards of any professional today, essentially broke, hustling for expenses, funding herself, dragging her enormous talent from one continent to the next with none of the security her ability should have bought. And she was lonely. The tour was a small, grueling, itinerant world, and for all her dominance on court, she was, off it, a shy country girl a long way from a tin-roofed house in Albury, unsure of who she was when she wasn't holding a racket. So, in 1966, at the very peak of her powers, she walked away. She had won everything. She was the best in the world, and she retired, 24 years old, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. It is one of the most telling decisions of her whole life, and it gets glossed over as a mere hiatus. It was not. It was a young woman who had achieved every goal that had ever been set for her, standing in the ruins of her own success and finding it strangely empty, wondering what any of it had been for. She opened a boutique in Perth, on the far side of the continent from everything she had known, about as far from Albury as an Australian can get without falling into the Indian Ocean. She tried for a while to be an ordinary person. She sold clothes. She woke up without a training session waiting to swallow the day. She had spent her entire life being told she was extraordinary, and now she wanted to find out whether she could simply be Margaret, a young woman in a Perth shop, with the whole of a normal life stretching out ahead of her. It is worth pausing on how strange that must have felt. From the age of 8, she had been defined by a single thing, and she had chased it with a completeness that left room for almost nothing else. No long adolescence, no drifting, no ordinary young womanhood, just the relentless forward motion of a career that had begun before she was old enough to choose it. To stop, at 24, was to stand still for the first time in her life and to hear, in the sudden quiet, a question she had never had time to ask. If I am not the best tennis player in the world,
then who exactly am I? What she found in Perth, instead of an ending, was a beginning she had not gone looking for. His name was Margaret Court, a yachtsman and wool broker, the son of a prominent Western Australian political family. His father had been a senior state minister, and Barry himself would one day serve as the state's agricultural minister. They married on the 28th of October, 1967, the same year she was made a member of the Order of the British Empire for her service to sport. And here is one of the small, human details that makes her worth remembering as a person rather than a record. Barry had never once left Australia. So Margaret, who had circled the planet on her own for a decade, made him a promise that sounds almost tender. "Maybe I'll go back and play," she told him, "and you'll come with me, and you'll see where I've been and who I've become out there." Marriage did not end her career. It gave her a reason to begin it again, this time not alone. She returned to the game in 1968, and what followed was, by any honest measure, the greatest sustained run in the history of women's tennis. Married, settled, no longer the frightened girl carrying the whole thing by herself, she was somehow better than she had ever been. In 1969 and 1970, she won 7 of the 8 majors on offer, and the one she missed still stings to read about. A Wimbledon semi-final in 1969 against Anne Hayden-Jones, lost across 3 long sets, the last 2 slipping away after she had taken the first. It was the old story, the nerves and the grass and the ghosts, but it would be the last time they beat her when it counted. The advent of the Open era in 1968 finally tore down the wall between amateurs and professionals, and it arrived just in time to give her comeback a stage worthy of it. For the first time, the game she had dominated in near poverty could actually pay her, and the prize money and the professionalism transformed the tour into something recognizably modern. She turned professional that year and threw herself back into a sport that had changed while she was away, and it turned out to fit her better than it ever had. The nerves were still there, they never entirely left, but they had less to feed on now. She was a grown woman with a marriage and a home behind her, no longer the isolated girl trying to hold up the whole enterprise on her own thin shoulders. Because in 1970, she did the thing that only Maureen Connolly had done before her. She won all 4 major singles championships in the same calendar year: the Australian, the French, Wimbledon, and the United States title. The true Grand Slam, the one that even the greatest players spend entire careers chasing and never touch. It was part of a run of 6 major singles titles in a row, an almost mechanical stretch of dominance in which the best players in the world simply could not find a way past her. She was, in those 2 seasons, as close to unbeatable as women's tennis had ever produced. The Wimbledon final of that year, against Billie Jean King, is remembered as one of the finest women's matches ever played. 2 extraordinary competitors trading a marathon final set that would not break. King pushing her to the edge of the abyss she feared most, and Margaret refusing, this time, to fall in. She held on. She won her calendar slam on the very ground that had haunted her, and for a country girl who had been told at 13 she would one day conquer Wimbledon, the circle could hardly have closed more perfectly. The rivalry with King is worth sitting with, because it defined an era, and it defined how history would choose to remember her, not always fairly. On the court, Margaret had King's measure. Across their careers, she held the winning head-to-head, and she was rarely shy about pointing out that she had beaten Billie Jean far more often than the reverse. They were opposites in almost every way that mattered off the court. The quiet, conservative, deeply Catholic Australian from a 2-bedroom house in the bush, and the outspoken American who was becoming the face of a revolution in women's sport. They needed each other, in the way that great rivals always do. And they never entirely understood each other, in the way that great rivals rarely do. Then came motherhood, and the sport had almost no template for what she did next. She gave birth to her son Daniel in early 1972, and she came back. In an era when a woman having a baby was assumed to be the end of her athletic life, Margaret returned to the tour with an infant in tow, and, in 1973, produced one of the most staggering seasons anyone has managed. The Australian, the French, and the United States titles all in the one year.
the first mother in the modern game to win a major, hauling her talent and her baby and her husband around the world at once. Picture the sheer logistics of it, in an age with none of the support a modern athlete takes for granted. No sports science, no nutritionists, no traveling entourage of physios and coaches and nannies smoothing the path. A woman who had given birth a year earlier, dragging her body back to peak condition by will alone, then hauling that body and her infant son and her husband from the Australian summer to the clay of Paris to the hard courts of New York, winning 3 of the 4 biggest tournaments on earth while learning, at the same time, how to be a mother. There was no template because no one had done it. She invented the possibility as she went, and she made it look, from the outside, almost matter of fact, which is perhaps why the achievement has never been given the weight it deserves. She simply decided that having a baby did not have to mean the end of anything, and then she proved it in the most emphatic way available to her, by winning.
That she is remembered for anything else from 1973 is one of the strange cruelties of how sport gets written down. Because 1973 is also the year of the match everyone brings up, the one played not for a trophy, but for an argument. Bobby Riggs was 55, a former Wimbledon and US champion turned self-appointed loudmouth, a hustler who had worked out that the fastest way to attention in a changing world was to declare loudly that women's tennis was rubbish and that even an old man could beat its best. Most of the top women ignored him. Margaret, 30 years old and at the very height of her powers, did not. She took the bait, and she took it for the worst possible reason. She treated it as a lark, a bit of fun, a novelty to knock over before she got serious about the French in Wimbledon. She trained for power when she should have trained for trickery. She prepared to face a slugger and walked out to face a magician of junk. Lobs, drop shots, spins, an entire circus of soft nonsense designed to unstitch a rhythm player. It was Mother's Day, the 13th of May, and Riggs handed her a bouquet of flowers at the net. And then he dismantled her. 6-2, 6-1 in 57 minutes. The Mother's Day Massacre, they called it, and she wore it for the rest of her life. She was honest about it afterwards, more honest than most champions would ever be about their worst day. In treating Riggs with contempt, she admitted, in not giving him the respect she would grant any real opponent, she had blundered. It was a mistake of attitude, not of ability. She had won 3 of the 4 majors that same season, but it did not matter. The loss was the domino that set the bigger story in motion. Riggs, flush with victory, turned his taunting on Billie Jean King, who had turned him down before but could no longer refuse. And in September of 1973, she beat him in the Houston Astrodome in front of 30,000 people and 90 million more on television. And that match became the cultural landmark. Margaret's defeat became the prologue to someone else's triumph. Decades later, when the filmmakers came to tell the story, they would paint her as a sour footnote and neglect to mention, anywhere, that she was the winner of 24 major championships. That is the thing about being the setup to another person's legend. You get airbrushed. You become the shadow the light needs to look bright. She kept winning regardless. There were more children. Her first daughter, Marika, arrived in 1974, and Margaret came back again that same year. And there would be 2 more daughters after that, Teresa and Lisa. She kept lacing up and stepping out, a mother of a growing family competing at the highest level of a sport that had barely imagined such a thing was possible. And she was a founding member of the Players Association that the women created in a London hotel in 1973 to fight for their own future. Through all of it, there was Barry, the yachtsman who had never left Australia until she showed him the world, and the marriage held. Through the travelling and the winning and the 4 children and the long, strange second act that came after the rackets were put away. It held right to the end, more than half a century of it, an anchor for a life that had spent its early years in constant motion. That steadiness matters to the story. So many careers of that intensity leave wreckage behind them, broken partnerships and estranged children, and the quiet wreckage of people who gave everything to a game and had nothing left for the people at home. Hers did not. She built a family in the middle of a career that should have made a family impossible.
and she kept both. She played her final event in 1977, and the reason is as human as everything else about her. She learned she was pregnant with her fourth child, and there are some seasons you simply do not play. She retired for good with a haul that beggars belief. 24 singles majors, 19 women's doubles majors, 21 mixed doubles majors, 64 in all, more than any player in the history of the game. She is the only person ever to win every major title in singles, doubles, and mixed doubles, the boxed set, twice over. Numbers like that do not repeat. They are almost certainly hers forever. The honors came in a steady stream across the decades that followed. The ABC's Sportsman of the Year, twice, back when the country had barely a word for a Sportswoman of the Year. Election to the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 1979. A show court at Melbourne Park given her name in 2003. The game's highest international award, the Philippe Chatrier, in 2006. Elevation within the Order of Australia to its highest civil rank in 2021. And through all the ceremonial recognition ran the plain, undeniable fact underneath it. Nobody, man or woman, has ever won more of the tournaments that matter most. Djokovic drew level with her singles mark half a century after she set most of it, and even that took the greatest male player of the modern age his entire career to manage. The girl from the asbestos house set a bar that the very best in the world are still straining to reach. And then the silence. The thing every athlete dreads and few admit to. The crowds go home.
The tour rolls on without you. The body that was your entire identity for 30 years is suddenly just a body, ordinary, aging, folding laundry in a house in Perth. For most of them, this is the quietest tragedy of the sporting life. The long afternoon after the last match, the slow discovery that the world has moved its attention elsewhere. Margaret filled that silence in a way almost nobody saw coming. The Catholic girl from Albury, the one who had muttered about sin and never felt at home among the liberationists of her sport, found her way into the Pentecostal church, was ordained a minister in 1991, and toured her own country in a mobile ministry before founding a church of her own, the Victory Life Centre, in Perth in 1995. The Reverend Margaret Court. The most decorated tennis player who ever lived, spending the back half of her life preaching in the western suburbs, as far from centre court as it is possible to get. It is tempting to leave that transformation as a curiosity, but it deserves more respect than that, because in it you can read the shape of the same person who found tennis alone against a garage wall. Both were solitary callings pursued with total commitment. Both drew on a certainty in herself that the rest of the world did not always share. The girl who taught herself to volley by hitting a ball off timber 10,000 times, who worked as a receptionist to pay for the training other players were handed, who came out of retirement to conquer the very tournament that had frightened her, was never going to disappear quietly into an armchair the way so many champions do. She needed a purpose that consumed her whole, and when tennis could no longer be that thing, she went looking for another one, and found it in faith. Whatever a person makes of the destination, the drive that carried her there was the same drive that carried her to 24 majors. She did not know how to do anything by halves. She never had. Her later years brought a different kind of noise, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The convictions that had always set her apart from her peers hardened into public positions on marriage and on the rights of transgender people that many in the game she once ruled found impossible to accept. And the woman who had a show court at Melbourne Park, named in her honour, became, in her 70s and 80s, one of the most divisive figures Australian sport has produced. There are people who cannot separate the champion from the churchwoman, and there are others who feel the two were always the same, stubborn, singular person. The girl who taught herself to play against a garage wall, who switched hands because someone told her to, and then beat the world with the wrong one, who never once in her life did the expected or the easy thing. History has not finished arguing about her, and perhaps it never will. But strip all of that away for a moment and go back to the beginning, to the thing underneath the noise.
Go back to the tin roof ticking in the Albury heat, and the 24 green courts shimmering across the road, and a barefoot tomboy with a fence paling and a dead tennis ball, hitting and hitting and hitting against the weatherboard while her father slept off a shift at the butter factory. No one was watching. No one expected anything. She was a kid who had almost died being born, in a family with no car and no interest in the game, in a country town at the edge of the map, and she decided, entirely on her own, for no reason anyone could name, that she was going to be the best there was. There was no scholarship, no academy, no scout with a checkbook, no path laid down for a working-class girl from Albury to walk. There was a wall and a ball and a road to cross, and a kindness from a man named Wal Rutter, and after that there was only her own bottomless refusal to stop. Every kid who ever hit a ball against a shed wall in the fading light of an Australian afternoon, dreaming of something bigger than the town they were born into, was, whether they knew it or not, doing exactly what she did. The difference is that she kept going. And she was. She simply, quietly, relentlessly was. Whatever you make of the woman she became, that particular fact belongs to no argument and no film and no committee. It belongs to Albury, and to Wal Rutter, and to a girl who found a door standing open and walked straight through it into history, and never once looked back to wonder whether she was allowed.